They used to say the land whispered, if you stood still long enough, that it wasn't just wind you heard in the hollowed hills of Monroe County, Kentucky, but memory. Ragged, damp, aching memory buried beneath the tobacco fields and ancient oaks. No one ever explained why the fences leaned in that part of the world, or why so many roads ended in dead silence. But even the map bore witness to the strangeness. An irregular splotch of land between Tompkinsville and Fountain Run, where property deeds went missing and the census thinned like breath on a cold window. A place they called Our Rest. Not a town, not even a village, more of an idea, or maybe a mistake. In 1917, the first official disappearance was recorded. A mail carrier named James Lattimore, last seen delivering letters to an unnamed recipient at a secluded chapel north of Mudlick Creek. The horse returned without him, reins dragging in the soil like a question no one wanted answered. His disappearance made local papers, but the details blurred almost immediately. No body, no suspects, no motive, just gone. Over the next 27 years, another 311 names would be added to what officials never formally acknowledged as a list. Mothers, fathers, entire families, drifters, preachers, children, people unmoored from the world, as if the very soil pulled them under. Some were missed, others barely noticed, but the silence was cumulative, and by 1944, the weight of it had begun to rot the edges of reality. The curious thing was this: every last one of them had at some point passed through the hidden valley known only to its dwellers as Our Rest, a secluded religious community with no official records, no post office, no census entries after 1920. Even the roads into it were unmarked, narrow things that turned to clay after rain. They didn't advertise themselves as a cult, didn't ask for money, didn't wear robes or chant in Latin. But when you stood on their land, it was like standing inside a sealed room where air and time moved differently. The community had been founded in the aftermath of the Civil War by a man named Reverend Silas Gideonor, a Deaf Rock Methodist minister with ties to both Union and Confederate chaplains. He called it a sanctuary, a holy place free from the corruptions of government, commerce, and bloodline. There were no denominations inside Our Rest, no politics, no paper trails, just prayer, fasting, and what they called the interval, a mysterious ceremony held on equinoxes and solstices in an underground chamber carved from limestone. Outsiders were not welcome during the interval. The doors were locked, the bells stopped ringing. No one knew what happened inside, but after each ceremony, something was always gone. A girl from the outskirts, a tenant farmer, a hired hand traveling through, the kind of people who didn't get headlines, the kind of people who could be missed for weeks without anyone raising alarm. The sheriff at the time, a man named Roy Camden, wrote a letter in 1923 to the state police describing a scent in the hills that smells like boiled copper and burnt cotton, and claimed he saw a procession of barefoot parishioners walking at midnight, blindfolded and silent, toward the limestone chapel. The letter was never followed up. By the late 1930s, a pattern had begun to take shape for those willing to look, but few were. Those who asked too many questions, like the young schoolteacher from Glasgow who tried to document the disappearances in a journal, were either driven away or simply erased. Her name was Mildred Paxton, 25, unmarried, inquisitive. She made weekly visits to Our Rest to tutor children in basic literacy, always supervised by one of the elders. She began noticing small details: bruises hidden under sleeves, children who could recite scripture but not their own names, and older members who insisted they had never been born, but instead had been called from the ash. She wrote it all down, carefully, persistently, in a series of leather-bound notebooks that she kept hidden in a flour tin behind her wood stove. On September 16, 1939, she vanished during a rainstorm on her way back from the community. Her bicycle was found in a ditch, chain snapped, seat torn. Her house was searched by a local reverend named Amos Kellum, who reported no unusual evidence. The notebooks were never found. Neither was Mildred. Rumors grew, not just of disappearances, but of transformations, survivors of the community. Those few who left and dared speak, spoke of changing shadows and sleeping beneath the roots. One man claimed his sister had come back from the interval with a different voice, a deeper one, and that she no longer recognized the moon as real. Another described waking up underground, blindfolded, his mouth filled with ash, and a circle of elders humming in a tongue he couldn't identify. When asked why he stayed, he simply said, "Because there is no outside when you're inside it." By the time World War II began, the disappearances slowed. Perhaps the war made people less curious. Perhaps our rest had already consumed what it needed. But in 1944, a final disappearance occurred that would reignite the fire, briefly and tragically. A state geologist named Franklin Wyatt entered the area to survey limestone formations rumored to contain unusual mineral deposits. He kept meticulous field notes, described a hum that came from the rocks themselves, like a low hymn echoing from beneath. He was last seen approaching a crevice near the old chapel with a lantern and a spade. 3 days later, a search party found his journal beside an extinguished fire. The last entry read, "The stone is not stone, it breathes, it remembers, and it wants." No further trace of Franklin Wyatt was found. This prompted a short-lived investigation, but no one was charged, and no body was recovered. The war effort took precedence, and the file was quietly closed in 1945. By then, our rest had receded once more into silence, its paths grown over, its chapel shrouded in ivy. The state eventually claimed the land under eminent domain in 1952, citing tax issues and infrastructure needs. But when workers arrived to clear the area, they found it abandoned. Not empty, abandoned. Meals half-eaten, beds unmade, fires still smoldering, no signs of struggle, just a community that had, once again, vanished. Only one structure remained intact, the limestone chapel, locked, sealed, and humming, faintly if you pressed your ear to the stone. The official records end in 1952, but the story doesn't. What is buried never stays silent forever. The land keeps its memory, even if people forget. And some didn't forget. Some couldn't. In the spring of 1967, a young woman named Elise Camden, granddaughter of the former sheriff, returned to Monroe County after studying folklore and anthropology in Ohio. She came back not for roots or rest, but because of a single letter left in a safety deposit box, addressed to her by her grandfather before his death. The letter was dated December 12, 1944, and began with the words, "What we buried was not the people, but the thing that fed on them." He went on to describe findings that had never made it into police reports. Bones turned to chalk, teeth placed in perfect circles around tree trunks, and a language made of vowels that make your mouth bleed when spoken. He told Elise that our rest was not a cult in the conventional sense, but a vessel for something older than God, something that moved beneath limestone, something that needed memory, worship, and absence. Her training leaned on reason, cultural context, and the rational frameworks of religion as a social tool. But the more she read her grandfather's files, clippings, photographs, annotated maps, the more the familiar terrain of Kentucky seemed to warp. She began corresponding with archivists and local historians, most of whom were either uninterested or visibly uncomfortable discussing the subject. One man, a retired pastor named Gerald Root, agreed to meet with her in person. He was 91 years old and had served briefly as a missionary in the Monroe region during the 1930s. He told Elise that the people of our rest never saw themselves as followers. They didn't worship Silas Gideon, he said. They worshipped through him. He was a key, not a door. And the thing they were unlocking, no one ever wanted to name it. They only called it the guest. He described sermons whispered in the dark, where the concept of salvation was replaced with absorption, where individuality was not lost, but inverted, folded in on itself, until nothing remained but echo. Root handed Elise a photograph, a blurred, time-worn image of a narrow doorway carved into the side of a rock, half covered in moss. A figure stood in front of it, indistinct, arms raised. They said that doorway didn't lead to a room, he told her. It led to a memory of a room that hadn't happened yet. It was enough. Elise gathered her tools, tape recorder, field journal, map overlays, and set out for the coordinates marked on the back of the photograph. The hills were overgrown, as expected. The old roads had caved in. But when she reached the area where our rest once stood, she found not an overgrown ruin, but arrangement. Rocks positioned in concentric spirals, small altars made of bone and thistle, trees stripped of bark in straight vertical lines. She recorded the hum, faint but present, and described in her journal a pressure in the chest, as if the air was waiting to be acknowledged. She camped there 3 nights. On the second she awoke to the sound of bells, soft, distant, metallic, but no churches stood for miles. On the 3rd night she found a set of footprints around her tent, barefoot, dozens of them, yet the soil had not been disturbed beyond the immediate prints, as if the walkers had appeared in place rather than arrived. Elise returned home shaken, but determined. Over the next 5 years, she published a series of obscure academic articles that drew no major attention but were devoured by certain underground circles, people studying ancient ritual, forgotten sex, paranormal anthropology. She began to receive letters, handwritten, unmarked. One included a photograph of a woman who looked exactly like her, dated 1896, captioned simply, Elisheva, vessel sum 4. Another contained only 3 words, "You have been remembered." In 1974, Elise disappeared. Her last known movement was purchasing a one-way bus ticket to Red Boiling Springs, Tennessee, just across the state border, not far from where the terrain dips and folds into the same bedrock our rest once occupied. Her apartment was found untouched. Her tape recorder missing, her journals gone. A single note was left behind, written in her grandfather's handwriting, though he had been dead for nearly 2 decades. It read, "We do not die, we are invited." The case was never investigated seriously. Her colleagues dismissed it as a mental breakdown, perhaps voluntary disappearance, but beneath that polite academic disinterest was a palpable fear. One professor, who had co-authored a paper with her on ritualized vanishment in isolated American sects, later resigned his post and moved to rural Maine, citing persistent voices. He refused to speak publicly thereafter. Meanwhile, the land did not forget. Reports continued, quietly, sporadically, of people hiking through Monroe's backcountry and emerging days later with gaps in memory, strange symbols carved into their boots, dreams they couldn't describe but woke from sobbing. In 1981, a construction project aiming to extend a rural road unearthed a chamber beneath the bedrock, circular, 10 feet in diameter with 13 indentations along the wall. No one could determine its origin. Within a week, 3 workers involved in the excavation quit, refusing to discuss why. One moved to Arizona. Another was later institutionalized after claiming that the limestone bled when drilled. A journalist named Roderick Vale took interest in the case and began assembling a book titled The Guest Beneath the Stone. He traced Elise's journey, visited the same sites, interviewed descendants of those who had once lived on the periphery of our rest. His writing turned strange, increasingly poetic, fragmented. He began referring to our rest not as a place but as an organ, not something you find but something you are inside of. He sent the manuscript to a publisher in 1984, but the package arrived empty, only the envelope sealed and addressed with nothing within. Vale vanished 2 months later. His last published article, written under a pseudonym, included the line, "The threshold is memory. When we forget, we open." Then, for a time, the story faded, as all stories do. Dust layered over the records. The newspaper clippings yellowed. People moved on. Monroe County aged quietly. The hills remained still. But silence isn't absence. Silence is waiting. In 1999, a series of droughts caused the water level in a small artificial lake near the presumed location of our rest to drop dramatically. Fishermen began finding odd objects, keys with no teeth, Bibles with every page blank except for one verse, Isaiah 26:20, "Come, my people, enter your chambers, and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the wrath has passed by." Then came the bones. 3 skulls, smooth symmetrical holes drilled into the center of each forehead. Not by violence, but with precision, surgical even. The lake was drained. More bones surfaced,
In total, fragments of at least 60 individuals were found, men, women, children, all buried in tight fetal positions, facing the same direction, east. An investigation was opened, briefly, but DNA testing was inconclusive. The bones had no matches in any national database. It was as if they had never been registered among the living. Local authorities buried them quietly in an unmarked grave, and yet on the night they were reinterred, a windstorm tore through Monroe County. Trees bent without breaking, cattle wandered from barns without latches being opened, and in the sky, some claimed, a line of 13 lights flickered once and vanished.
The lights were never explained, not by meteorologists, not by astronomers, and certainly not by the county. Those who saw them never quite agreed on what they resembled. Some said stars, others called them eyes, but all agreed on the number 13. The same number as the indentations in the underground chamber, the same number etched into a tree stump behind the old chapel in one of Elise Camden's lost photographs. 13, like the stations of a forgotten cross. It would have been easy, comforting, even to let this strange history remain buried. But in 2011, the story surfaced again, this time in the most unremarkable way, through an online forum dedicated to rural architecture. A user named MPaxton1944 posted grainy photos of an overgrown limestone structure, half collapsed but strangely symmetrical. Accompanying the photos was a short caption, "My grandmother disappeared in Monroe County. I think I found where." The post went largely ignored, except by a small group of folklore enthusiasts who noted the location bore similarities to descriptions in the unpublished work of Roderick Vale. 3 days later, the user deleted their account, but the photos remained, and within them, hidden in the brush, nearly invisible, was a figure, pale, still, facing the photographer. Zoomed in, the figure's mouth was open, as if speaking, but the words, if they ever existed, were lost in pixel decay. Curiosity stirred once again. A small podcast called Hollow Ground picked up the thread. In a 2-part episode aired in late 2012, they recounted the legend of our rest, the disappearances, and the mysterious figure in the forum post. The podcast was modestly successful, until episode 3. That episode never aired. According to co-host Aaron Delancey, the final recording was corrupted by a low-frequency distortion that kept repeating one word, interval. His partner, Mara Keene, reportedly experienced auditory hallucinations while editing, chanting, weeping, the sound of earth being shoveled. She withdrew from public life shortly after. Still, the story refused to die. The land, it seemed, was hungry again. Between 2013 and 2018, local emergency services recorded a slow uptick in disappearances along the borderlands of Monroe County. Hikers, retirees, a pair of journalists researching early Pentecostal sects, one family of 4 who had moved to the area for a quieter life. Their last message, left on a voicemail to a relative, consisted only of static and the sound of distant bells. The pattern had returned, but the difference now was attention. The internet, the archive of everything, had awakened something that once thrived on secrecy, and perhaps it didn't like to be seen. The final piece of the story comes not from a newspaper, not a tape, not even an eyewitness. It comes from the soil itself. In 2021, a team of geology students from Western Kentucky University were granted access to an unincorporated tract of forest land previously closed for environmental restoration. There, they drilled core samples for a study on karst formations, ordinary work, but within one core, pulled from a depth of 83 feet, they discovered what should have been impossible, a series of tiny carvings inside the stone, symmetrical and deliberate, forming a spiral of letters that repeated a phrase, "We remember you who remember." The carving was authenticated, but its origin remains unexplained. No known tool could have performed such inscriptions at that depth without disturbing the strata. The sample was locked in university archives, then quietly transferred to a private research facility. No public statement was made, but those who saw it, those who held that piece of limestone in their gloved hands, say it vibrated, slightly, as if alive, as if waiting. There is a theory, only a theory, that what happened in our rest wasn't an isolated event, or even a singular location, that perhaps it was a door that had,
once opened, replicated itself in echoes across time, not in space, but in memory, that wherever enough forgetting occurs, the threshold appears, that the guest, whatever it was, did not need worship in the way we understand. It needed witness, absence, the collapse of certainty. Because if no one knows where someone went, if no one can remember who they were, then something else remembers for them. Something ancient, something kind in the way that erosion is kind, slow, absolute, inevitable. It would be easy to dismiss all of this, to relegate it to the category of myth, folklore, madness. But one final detail resists dismissal. As part of her work in the 1970s, Elise Camden had tried to catalogue every known disappearance associated with our arrest. Her research indicated 312 individuals between 1917 and 1944, but her notes included a 13th ledger, blank at first, then in faint graphite, written sideways across the final page, 313, me, and then nothing, until 2025, this year, when a new name was added. A local woman named Harper Wynne, a teacher from Glasgow, went hiking alone in the area south of the old chapel site. She told friends she was retracing Elise Camden's final journey. Her last known message was a text, sent to a colleague. I found the door. She never returned. Her phone was recovered, cracked but intact. One photo remained undeleted. It shows a stone archway carved into a cliffside, perfectly symmetrical, its opening sealed with what appears to be fused bone. In the lower right corner of the photo, written in ash across the ground, we are the rest. The total number now stands at 314, but numbers are comfort. Numbers imply boundaries. Numbers end. The truth is stranger and more circular, like a prayer that has no first word, like a ritual spoken only once long ago and echoed forever. There are those who say that our rest still exists, not as a place, but as a shape, a memory waiting to be entered, a silence that calls itself peace, a door made not of wood or stone, but forgetting. They say if you walk long enough through the hills, where the trees grow too close, and the light never quite settles, you'll hear bells. And after the bells singing, and after the singing, your own name spoken from behind you by a voice you once knew, and then nothing at all. Not fear, not pain, only the rest.